So you want a pet that is long, lacks legs, and is an awesome cold-blooded companion, but is not a snake. So that leaves your options down to an eel or the legless lizard. Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Adam. I'm the owner of Uncharted Wild and all the 70 plus animals that live in this house. I am joined today by Rufus, my European giant legless lizard, and we're going to talk about what it's like to take care of him. But before we get into the actual care itself, I have a few warnings. Number one, do as much research as you possibly can before you bring this animal home. Don't let this be the only thing you watch. Read other care sheets. Try and learn as much as you can before you bring a legless lizard home, because they're a little bit different than taking care of like a gecko or bearded dragon. So you want to know your stuff. You want to try and learn as much as possible so you have a good idea what you're getting into. And number two, we are not going to be talking about breeding in this care video, as I don't in any of my care videos, because I know nothing about breeding animals. I know nothing about genetics or whatever, brood mating, whatever. So we're not going to talk about it today. The European legless lizard goes by a few names, one of which is the Celtopusic. I might have pronounced that wrong, but I'm going to have it written right there so you can see. And by no means is it the only legless lizard on the planet. There are a ton of species, but it is the most common in captivity. They'll end up somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 feet, and then large males over 4 foot aren't unheard of, but they're not exactly common. And like I said, this is Rufus. He's my education legless lizard, and some days he's really grumpy and constantly trying to wiggle out of my hands, and other days he kind of sits pretty still in my hand and he's pretty good. So right now he's doing pretty good, but we'll see how he goes. I'll talk about handling later in the video. I have no idea if he's a male or female. The guy I got him from had no idea. I've been calling him Rufus because Rufus kind of sounds like a grumpy sounding name, and he's a little bit of a grump, so it fit. Now, they are very hard to sex unless you like avert the hemipenes. There are no like femoral pores or real hemipenal bulges like you see in a lot of other lizard species. There are no huge visual indicators, so you kind of just pick a name and just deal with it. They aren't really being captive bred. Just about any of the legless lizards you see for sale at expos, which are really the only place you're going to find them. There aren't a whole lot of places online that have them, and you're not going to find them at a pet store, but just about all the ones you see at expos are going to be wild caught or imported, which is unfortunate because normally if you can get a captive born reptile, that's the best one to do. They adjust better to captivity, they adjust better to you, they adjust better to just overall care in your enclosure and everything than a wild caught one usually does. But unfortunately, just no one's really working these on a huge scale like tegus or monitor lizards or beardies or blue tongues, so just about all of them are imported. So just be aware that if you really are dead set on getting a legless lizard. Now, as far as price goes, they're not overly expensive. You can find most of them for somewhere in the $50 to $100 range, somewhere in the 1 to 2, maybe 3 foot range. Now, I have seen a couple really big males, like 4 foot and over, go for a few $100s, but again, those are kind of far and few between. So for the most part, you're spending under $100. Now, as I said, these lizards can get pretty long and they are very active, so you're going to need a good bit of space. Rufus right now is in a 40-gallon breeder-size aquarium tank, which is what the minimum I would say would be for a lizard this size. Obviously, they move around a lot, so if you give them more space, they will use it. And if you have a really big male, they're going to need something like 75 gallons or more. Now, for housing, you have quite a few options. First up would be glass aquariums, because they're kind of the easiest to find. Just go to a pet store, Amazon, whatever. Now, like I said, for a 2 or so foot adult, minimum you want 40-gallon breeder. 75 would be good for an adult about any size. They can be bulky and hard to move though, especially if you have a really big tank, but they are easy to clean. You also want to make sure you get a very secure lid, like a mesh lid with clamps and stuff, because they are huge escape artists. Rufus has gotten out quite a few times. Luckily, he has nowhere to go, so I find him in the same exact corner of the reptile room every time, but you just want to make sure. Next up is my personal favorite, PVC. It is very nice looking. It is very easy to lift and move. They're fairly lightweight, but you usually need to pay for them, and they are a bit pricey. You need to buy them from somewhere unless you have to know how to do it yourself. I would say for an adult, you're looking at a 2 to 3 foot, maybe 4 foot long enclosure should be good. Obviously, if you can do something bigger, they'll love it. And then you also just want to make sure, because they like a lot of substrates, you're going to want to make sure that the sliding doors or the front opening doors, whatever you have, is a bit higher up to allow that substrate in there so it's not knocking out anytime you open the doors and falling in the tracks or on the ground, whatever. And then you have wood enclosures, which again, you'll probably have to buy from somewhere unless you have to know how to do it yourself. The wood will need to be sealed, which is another layer of expenses. And then it's usually really heavy, but they are sturdy, so I will give it that. But Again, I would prefer an aquarium or a PVC over a wood enclosure, but it's up to you. There's also plastic bins. Now, racks really won't work for a legless lizard. This size, maybe if you had something like 2 foot by 3 foot, like one for a colubrid or something like that. But if you have a big male, it really won't work unless you have like one of those big heavy duty industrial ones with like the metal pull out drawers that are like 4 foot wide or something like that. And then for standalone plastic bins, again, you would need something pretty big, and it would be nice, lightweight and very nice and easy to clean, but you're going to need to make sure that lid is very, very secure, because if they find a single inch of wiggle room, they will probably try and get out. They like loose substrate that they can dig down into, so I would say minimum 3 inches of substrate, and you can go all the way up 5, 6 inches, 7 inches, whatever you want to do. If you still need to be able to find your lizard, you'll probably want to stay on like the 3 to 4 inch range, and that'll make them happy. So while easy to clean options like reptile carpet or newspaper or paper towel will work fine for bearded dragons and leopard geckos, uromastyx, they won't really work for these guys. You will need some kind of loose substrate. Now, as far as the bedding goes, the two you really want to avoid are calcium sand, because they are not really a desert animal, so they don't need straight sand anyways, but calcium sand is just a garbage bedding. And you also want to avoid cedar and pine wood chip bedding. Now, I do know some people that keep on aspen, and I'll talk about that next, but you want to avoid cedar and pine. They are not good. They're finding they're not good for most small animals, so just avoid those ones. Now, aspen bedding is a very popular substrate for a lot of snakes especially. It holds burrows very well. It holds a little bit of humidity, but not a whole lot. I use it for a lot of my snakes. I don't use it for my legless lizard, though, because they do like a lot of humidity when they dig down in, so I use something else, but I know plenty of people that still use this. What I recommend most are usually either coconut husk, one of those jungle mix reptile brand beddings. What I actually do, in what I've mentioned in a few videos, is I use a sand soil mix for my substrate. I think my mix is about 60% topsoil and 40% washed play sand. My substrate's also semi-bioactive. I don't have any plants in there because when I tried, he just dug them up. But I do have some cleanup crew in there, like little mealworm beetles. I have isopods and springtails. They usually hang out under the humid hide and under the water bowl, because that's kind of where the soil's the dampest, so they like it there, and those help with waste breakdown. Being a diurnal lizard, you can offer them a basking spot. Now, they don't bask a whole lot, and they don't need a basking temperature or anything like what a bearded dragon or a uromastyx needs. Something in like the low 90s, 92 I think is what my basking spot usually sits at. They don't need it super, super hot. You want the overall temp to range from the mid 70s on the cool side to the mid to low 80s for the warm side. Again, they don't need it super hot, and you do want them to have some type of temperature gradient so they can warm up and cool off. And they can actually take a nighttime drop of 5 to 10 degrees. Again, your lizard won't keel over and die if these are off by a little bit. That's why I'm giving you kind of a range. It's not like if your basking spot is like 88 degrees, your lizard's gonna die, you'll be fine. It's just these are what I recommend. And get yourself a temperature gun. You can find them at just about any hardware store on Amazon. You just click it and it tells you the exact temperature of the surface. It's super handy to have, and it's much more trustworthy than those crappy little ones that you stick on the wall with tape. Those are usually very incorrect. So again, temp gun, easiest purchase you'll probably make as a reptile owner. Humidity, they don't need it super dry and arid like a desert lizard, and they don't want it super damp and wet like a tropical lizard. They're fine somewhere in the middle. Again, they're not picky. Somewhere in the 30 to 50% range, probably fine. And then if you want, you can mist down the enclosure, especially the substrate, every day or every other day, something like that, depending on what your setup is like. And this will help because they do like the substrate being a little bit more humid than the air, and this helps especially when they dig down and when it's time to shed, which Rufus is actually in shed right now. For heating, again, there's quite a few options. First up is the most popular one, and the one I use for Rufus is just a heat bulb, just a regular old, I think mine's 75 watt heat lamp. And then again, you don't need anything super intense like 150 watts like you would for a monitor or a Tegu or anything like that. And it'll depend on how far away your basking spot is, how deep your substrate is, how far away the lamp is, and you can just kind of get a different wattage and play around with the depth and stuff then. And for nighttime, you don't really need a heat lamp for night, as long as your temperatures, I would say, stay above the low 60s, you'll be fine. If you do need like some type of nighttime heat source, don't use a red light, get like a black light or something like that, or one of the other heat options we're about to talk about. Usually you want to avoid those red lamps, and they do need some type of day-night cycle, so you don't want to just leave a bright white light on all 24 hours. And these work best for glass aquariums with a mesh lid, or even a PVC or a wooden enclosure that either has a hole cut out with mesh on top that the lamp can sit there, or a socket on the interior where you can actually screw in the bulb. Now, if the bulb is inside with the lizard in a PVC or a wooden enclosure, you will need to get one of those like light bulb cages to put around it, because the lizard will try and get up to it and he can burn himself on it. So you just want to make sure there's no direct contact. Heat tape and under the tank heaters don't really work well for this species. They work fine for a lot of snakes and other lizard species, but for these guys, because of that substrate depth that they need, again, 3 inches minimum, they would really have to dig down to really feel it. So I think the other heat options work better. Radiant heat panel is another option that will work just fine depending on your setup. They don't work for glass aquariums with mesh lids, and again, you don't want to use them in like a plastic bin, but they work just fine for PVC and wood enclosures. You will need a thermostat for it to control the temperature, and most of them now have a certain coating on it so that even when the heat is on and kicking, it won't burn the lizard if it comes into contact with it. Last option would be a ceramic heat emitter, which is basically a bulb that doesn't give off light, it just gives off heat, and these guys can burn real hot, so you want to make sure there is absolutely zero contact between the lizard and this bulb. And again, a lot of them can burn way too hot than this lizard needs, so you'll want to find one on the lower wattage end, but you can make it work. Again, they are a diurnal lizard, so they need a UV light. They need those rays to help synthesize calcium. They need them to help stave off things like metabolic bone disease and other health ailments, so you need a good UV light. And there are 2 different options I recommend, both of which work very, very well. First up is a mercury vapor bulb, which is essentially a special light bulb that combines UV and heat. And I'm going to have links for everything I'm talking about in the description below, so you don't have to like go hunting down what this means and what one to get. This is a great bulb that works very well. I use this for most of my lizards. I use it for my monitors, my tegus, my beardies. So this way, as they're basking, they get that UV light. And with these bulbs, these are very good, but they do come in a few different wattages. I think 80 watt is the lowest I've found that's from a reliable brand. So 80 watt is probably what you want to get for these guys. They don't need anything like 160 watt ZoomEd Power Sun or anything like that. That is way too much heat for these guys. The second option is actually what I use, and this is a tube UV bulb. Now there's 2 different types. You got a T5 and a T8. Both of them will work. I actually have a T5 10.0 ZoomEd Reptile Sun, and then you combine that with a heat lamp, because these tube lights, they don't give off heat, they just give off UV. So the nice thing about the MVB that we just talked about is you only need 1 light fixture, whereas this one you'll need 2. Now eventually you'll need to replace these UV bulbs, because even though they'll still be giving off light and they won't look any different to you, they will eventually burn out of giving UV rays off. So you will need to replace them. For the T5s and the Power Suns, I recommend doing it every 10 to 12 months, and then for the T8s you'll have to do it every 6 months. One last thing about UV bulbs, you're going to find a bunch of UV bulbs in the $15 to $30 price range. Avoid these bulbs. These are cheapo ones. They've been shown to give off almost no UV light. They don't give off what your lizard needs, so you want to avoid these bulbs. With UV lights, you get what you pay for. So if you pay for a $15 UV light and it gives off no UV, your lizard's probably going to get metabolic bone disease and get sick over time. If you want to pay for the $40 to $50 UV light that's good, that one, your lizard's going to be much happier with it. For water, they don't need anything crazy. Get them a decent sized water bowl that they can get into. You'll never see a legless lizard like hanging out in his water bowl like you would a snake, especially when it's time to shed. So just get them a decent sized one that they can get into if they want and get out. Now, 60% of the time, I find Rufus usually dug up underneath the water bowl when I'm looking for him. He's not one of his hides, so he must just like the kind of extra humid dirt underneath the water bowl. For decorating the enclosure, mine has one straight kind of plastic cave hide and then a cork bark roll he sleeps in on the other side sometimes. You do want to give him a couple different hides, but honestly, he spends a lot of his time in the dirt, and like I said, he spends a lot of his time sleeping under the water bowl. You want to give him a bunch of different textures and things to climb on and stuff. You want to use branches, pieces of cork bark, rock. You can use fake things from pet stores, fake plants, things like that. And then one thing with rocks though, you want to make sure that they're like either sitting on the actual tank bottom or the enclosure bottom. You want to make sure that there's not enough dirt under that he can get under there and dig it up, and then he might collapse on him if you're using a really big rock, so just be careful of that. You got quite a few choices to feed these dudes, but most of them will be some type of bug. Superworms, dubia roaches, crickets, there's quite a few bugs out there for you to choose from. Now mine usually prefers to eat out of a glass bowl in his enclosure. I'll just dump a few superworms or roaches in there, and he doesn't usually eat off the tongs. He has eaten a few dubia roaches off the tongs, but usually he prefers to eat in his little bowl undisturbed. You can feed snails, but you got to be careful where you get them from, because parasites are kind of a concern depending on your source. In the wild, they do mostly eat snails, but again, that can sometimes be hard to recreate in captivity. You can also feed them pinky mice on occasion. Mine has never gone for them, but I know a few people that do feed it to theirs. Lastly, they can also be fed some non-whole prey items, one of which is a little bit of egg, either scrambled or hard-boiled with the shell. Again, mine's never really gone for this. He really just seems to like the the bugs, but I know plenty of people that their legless lizard loves scrambled eggs. You can also do a high quality dog or cat food. I personally never tried that with my legless lizard, but there are a bunch of people out there that it's worked for them. My blue tongue though does get that once a week. Speaking of, for your adults, you want to feed them twice a week is fine. And then for juveniles, you probably want to do 3 to 4 times a week. They don't need to eat every single day. They're not like a growing leopard gecko or anything like that. They don't need that much food. And you want to feed them as much as they'll eat in kind of a single like serving or single feeding in like 5 to 10 minutes. What I usually do is I'll drop the superworms or roaches into his little glass bowl, and then I'll wake him up. If he's digging underground, I'll find him and I'll put him in front of his bowl so that he sees they're in there, he knows they're in there, and then I'll usually leave for 5 to 10 minutes, come back, he's usually back hiding or moving somewhere else, and then I'll take whatever's left in his bowl and I'll take him out. You want to dust the food twice a week with calcium powder, whether that's the cat or the dog food, the scrambled eggs, the bugs, whatever you're using, twice a week with the calcium powder, and then once a week or every other week with the multivitamin powder. And with the calcium powder, make sure when you buy it, you're checking the label, because there's calcium with D3 and calcium without. If you have a good UV light, you don't need the calcium with D3. Get the regular old calcium powder. That's all you need. You can still use calcium with D3 once or twice a month if you want, but calcium without D3 is perfect. Now, handling legless lizards can be tricky. It's like holding a sausage that's constantly wiggling and moving. They don't grip you back like a snake does. Their body and muscles aren't designed that way. They're rather rigid and inflexible compared to a snake's anatomy. Now, the real question isn't if you want to hold your legless lizard. The real question is if your legless lizard wants to be held, which 90% of the time is no. As you can see, my pretzel lizard here is the most well-behaved he has been in a very long time. Now, Rufus is actually on the more handleable side. As you can see, he is being very well-behaved. He's not, oh, there we go. He's not always like this, and I'm not going to edit this out right now so you guys can see kind of what he's doing, because he's kind of just like, okay, I'm done right now. And I've taken him to a bunch of programs. He has gotten much, much better than when I first got him 4 years ago. But he still needs a lot of work. It's not like holding a snake. It's not like picking up a corn snake or my rat snake or anything like that. He's got moods, and some days he does not want to be held at all. Today he's being very, very well behaved, probably because there's not his kids around. But even when I take him to programs with kids, for the most part, he's usually really, really good. I don't usually let kids hold him. They're usually a little kind of too jittery and jumpy, but he's been held by quite a few adults, no problem. And they usually do let kids pet him. Usually if I'm holding him and he's kind of in a calm mood, he'll let kids kind of take 2 fingers and pet down the back, no problem. You can kind of see he just kind of stopped moving right there. And it really depends on his mood. Some days he really is just huffing and wiggling and constantly. And don't get me wrong, this is an exception. There are some legless lizards out there that want nothing to do with you. And most legless lizards are not like this handleable or well behaved, I would say. A lot of them, they range from being writhing constantly, just wriggling to get out of your hands, they'll poop on you, whatever, they want nothing to do with you, all the way up to some are very adamant about not wanting to be held and they use their mouth because they don't have much of a defense mechanism. That is one thing you need to be careful of when you're handling them. They can pop this tail off. The tail will drop right there where my finger's touching him. So he's about half body, half tail, and he will drop this tail off and they will regrow it, but it never looks quite the same. So you want to be kind of careful when you're handling them. But like I said, there are some that will say no with their mouth. They have a pretty nasty bite. Their teeth aren't sharp, they're blunted to help get through the shell of the snails they eat in the wild, but that can be almost more painful in a way. And I have met quite a few legless lizards, and I've seen even more online, where as soon as those doors open to their tank enclosure, whatever, they are mouth open, and if you get a finger in there, they're gonna bite you. Some of them can get very, very defensive and aggressive, so you just wanna be very careful. And again, if you're getting one at an expo, it's not a great indicator if you pick one up and held one, but if you get bit right away, you probably don't want to get that one. As I said, just about all of them at expos are wild caught, which means they're going to be more stressy, more difficult to work with. They are not going to be the most ideal pet when it comes to handling. These really are more of a kind of look at, don't touch. You might luck out and get one that kind of tolerates you, or get one that wants nothing to do with you. So just know that going in, this is most likely not a lizard you can pick up all the time like a blue tongue or a gecko or a beardy can. You just get, it's a very case by case basis. So that was my care video on the European giant legless lizard. Make sure, like I said, this is not your only research. Watch other care videos, read other care sheets. If you learned something like the video, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future videos that I post every Thursday. Comment down below if you have a legless lizard, because they are super cool pets if you do have one and you know what you're getting into. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you later.